Sarah Humphreys here from Edward and the White Bear, and today I'm just doing a short video on flying geese and showing you a couple of ways to make them. So I have an example of flying geese here in front of me. It's a very classic patchwork design, the right angle triangle here in a background, and you very often see flying geese in rows or flocks, I suppose, if it's geese. So that's a block that's just made up of two strips of flying geese. You will also see them in many traditional blocks. For example, the Dutchman's puzzle here. Each quarter has two flying geese in it, and there's two colours to give the appearance of movement in the block. You'll also very often see flying geese going round or in the borders of whole quilts. So I have a medallion quilt here that I'm working on, and there's a great long strip of flying geese that actually goes all the way round one of the borders. So really versatile, very traditional, but can be updated for modern quilts as well. So I'm going to show you two methods of making flying geese. One which might be known as a stitch and flip method, and the second is a no waste flying geese method. So we're going to start with the stitch and flip flying goose, and I'm just making one here, but you can make as many of them as you like. This method's really good if you're using up scraps and you wanted to just work with little bits of fabric, or if, like on my medallion quilt, you want all your geese to be different fabrics, then this is often the method to use. So the finished size of the flying goose will be 3 inches by 1.5 inches. That's when it's sewn into the quilt. So I'm starting with a rectangle for the goose, the main triangle, at 3.5 by 2 inches. And then I have two background squares which are 2 inches each. I start by taking one of the squares and lining it up with these three edges of the background rectangle, and I've got my line pointing from one corner into the middle, and I'm going to stitch on the line. So just be aware, if you're used to doing quarter square triangles, half square triangles where you stitch 1/4 inch past the line, that this one's a little bit different. I've changed the foot on my Janome as well, so this is the F foot. It's see-through plastic, so I can see the line that I'm stitching on, and it's got a little red mark centrally as well, which helps to keep me straight. Whatever machine you've got, you may well have something similar, or you can just use your regular everyday stitching foot. So set off stitching on that line. Sometimes it just needs a little bit of encouragement just at the point to get it going, and then stitch through. If you're doing a whole load of flying geese, you can just feed them in one after another. So I've stitched on that line. You can cut with a rotary cutter, or because it's only small, I'm just going to snip with a pair of scissors, and I'm taking off the excess triangle. So I've got my stitching line and then about 1/4 inch there, and then I'm going to iron this back, so that's why it's known as stitch and flip. So iron from the top to begin with, and then press into that seam. Make sure it's nice and flat. Okay, so I've lined up that diagonal line from the bottom corner into the middle, and I'm going to stitch on that line. There is a slight overlap at the top, that's meant to be there, so don't worry about that. So making sure I'm starting on that pencil line again. So nice and straight along the line, and then I can cut off the excess again. Always make sure you're only cutting off the bits that you need. Give that a press. And there you have your flying goose. So I mentioned there's a slight overlap there at the top. That's your seam allowance for when you're sewing your goose to another one. And if I turn it over, You can see where your lines of stitching cross. That's where my point is, and my seam allowance is at the top. So that's the stitch and flip method, and we're now going to have a look at the no waste flying goose. Now looking at the no waste flying goose method. I'm still working to the same finished size as I did with the stitch and flip, which is the 3 inches by 1.5 when it's sewn into the quilt. This time I'm starting with a much larger square for the geese. This is 4.5 inches square, and I have 4 smaller squares which are 2.5 inches each. But instead of just making one at a time, with this method you make 4 at a time. So a lot of people like this method, number one because it's quicker, you get 4 instead of 1, but also the no waste. So with the first method I was snipping off those little corners each time. This one, all your fabric gets used. So I get my largest square and I've drawn a diagonal line on the back of each of the smaller squares from corner to corner. I shall take 2 of these, right sides together, lining one up with that bottom corner to the left and one to the top right, and the 2 drawn lines should just come together in the middle. Now I want these to stay nice and flat when I'm sewing, so I am just going to put a few pins in, well out of the way of the sewing lines, but they will hold those squares in place and keep that centre overlapping. So this time, instead of sewing on the line, I'm going to sew 1/4 inch either side. So I will just change my foot to that 1/4 inch. So it's worth taking a moment when you set off on a technique just to make sure that you know whether it's on the line or just off the line, as it does vary. So I'm going to sew 1/4 inch either side. Just make sure when you get to the middle that again that's lined up and that you don't flip over that corner. And if your pins are getting in the way, you can take them out as you go. So that's one side, I've got my drawn line and the seam 1/4 inch past that. Turn it round and I'm going to do the same on the other side. So I've got 2 squares sewn on with the seam line 1/4 inch either side of that central drawn line. So I'm going to cut that in half. You can either do it with your rotary cutter or a pair of scissors. And then I'm going to press these. So as always, just press from the top to begin with, and then I'm pressing these little triangles out so the seam is underneath them. Nice firm press, make sure they lie flat, and do that with the second set as well. So you'll end up with 2 shapes that look like this. Take your second 2 squares and the square lines up with the corner of that green goose fabric, and the line goes through the middle and through the gap between the 2 background triangles. I'm just going to pin that in place again and repeat for the second one, again making sure that line's going from the bottom corner up through the gap between the triangles. And then repeat. So you're going to repeat the sewing 1/4 inch either side of that line. Because I'm doing 2, I'm just going to put 1 through after the other, chain piecing. And then as before, turn them around and do the second side. snip those apart, and then again cut on the drawn line, and you can either cut scissors or rotary cutter. Just got my scissors to hand. And then each of these opens up to make a flying goose. So as I said before, no waste, nothing cut off there, and you have 4 geese for the price of 1. So that's 2 methods of making flying geese, the stitch and flip method and the no waste flying geese method. Do let me know which one you prefer after you've had a go at both of them. And as always, if there's anything else you'd like to see, do let me know in the comments.